In this video, I'm going to pick up where I left off in part 1, where we are going to look at a few passages that critics most often claim the Bible contradicts itself. These aren't easy questions, and I'm not asking you to simply accept my conclusions. I'm asking you to do something much more important, and that is examine the evidence with me. Because if Christianity is true, it has nothing to fear from honest investigation. So, let's open up our Bibles, ask the hard questions, and see whether these passages truly contradict one another, or whether there's more to the story than most people realize. So stay tuned. Hello everyone, and welcome to this edition of Guys Gone Bible, a place where we explore, discuss, and teach various passages of the Bible and how we can learn to relate it to our lives. So, whether you're a long-time believer like me, you're just starting out, or you're somewhere in between, or even if you just stopped by because you were curious today, I am glad to have you. This podcast ministry is all about the gospel as stated in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-4, which states how Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, and he was raised again according to the scriptures. So even if you haven't adopted the gospel of Jesus Christ for yourself yet, that's perfectly fine. Feel free to sit back and relax, get something to eat or drink. And I felt like today's food suggestion was especially relevant since it's now summertime. People are going to be out barbecuing a little bit more. And if you're like me and you also like chocolate chip cookies at the same time, then maybe you would like a chocolate chip cookie hamburger. Now, I know putting a hamburger patty in between two chocolate chip cookies is a little bit weird, but maybe it would be pretty tasty, if you added a little bit of lettuce, ketchup and mustard, pickles as well.
Oh my gosh, Ryan, not another one of your stupid food ideas again.
What? This is a good idea this time, right? This way you can have both your dessert and dinner at the same time.
Oh my gosh.
Well, anyway, so in part 1, we examined several of the most common alleged contradictions in the Old Testament and the opening pages of the New Testament. And if you haven't watched part 1 yet, I encourage you to do so because I am not going to take the time to cover some of the things in part 2 that I'm not going to spend as much time on again. So if you're not aware about things I mentioned about what it makes an actual contradiction, or understanding things like genre, historical context, background, textual criticism, eyewitness principle, and so on, then you're likely going to be a little bit confused if you don't know about these things already. Just be sure that if you comment below about something I clearly mentioned in last week's episode without watching it, then I'm going to kindly remind you that you should have watched the episode to get a better grasp of what I'm talking about in this episode. I mentioned last week that many passages that are presented online as obvious contradictions become less problematic when we slow down, read them in context, and consider their historical and literary setting. So today we turn to what is arguably the most important question of all, and that is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Why? Because the Apostle Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 15, 13-14, that is, if Christ has not been raised, then our faith is futile. In other words, Christianity rises or falls on this one event. So it's no surprise that skeptics often focus on the resurrection narrative. Questions like, how many women went to the tomb? Was there one angel or two? Did the women tell anyone? Which disciple rise first? Are these actual contradictions, or are they different eyewitness perspectives? So let's examine them carefully. But before we do, remember the principle we established in part 1, that a contradiction occurs when two statements cannot both be true in the same sense at the same time. Different details are not automatically contradictory. If one witness says there were two police officers at an accident scene, and another witness says one officer spoke to him, those accounts can both be true. Mentioning one person does not deny the existence of the other. However, if one person says there were two officers at the scene and then another person says there was only one officer, that would be a contradiction. You're going to want to keep that principle in mind as we continue. So in section 1, we're going to discuss the stories that I mentioned in part 1. So let's start with who went to the tomb. One of the first objections concerns the women who visited Jesus' tomb. Matthew names Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, whereas Mark includes Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome. Luke mentions Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and other women. John initially focuses almost entirely on Mary Magdalene. Some conclude that these accounts cannot all be true. But let's think about how we naturally tell stories. Imagine you attend a family reunion with 15 relatives. And let's say that later one friend asks you who came, and maybe you answer your parents. And then maybe another friend asks you the same question, and you say, your parents, my sister, and my uncle. And then maybe later that same day, someone else asks you almost the entire family. So then the question then becomes, have you contradicted yourself? And of course, the obvious answer is no. You've simply emphasized different people depending on your purpose of your discussion with that friend. And so none of the gospel writers say only these women were present. They simply identify different members of the group. John's account even hints that Mary was not alone. After finding the tomb empty, she tells Peter, "We do not know where they have laid him." So notice that word there, we. Mary herself indicates others were with her. Far from contradicting the other Gospels, John's account fits comfortably alongside them. Next, we have one angel or two, and perhaps you've heard of this objection. Matthew mentions an angel, Mark mentions a young man dressed in white, whereas Luke mentions two men in dazzling apparel. John mentions two angels inside the tomb. So, how many were there? Was it one or two? Here's an important observation. If two angels are present, would it be incorrect for one writer to focus on the one who actually spoke? Not at all. Suppose, for example, two firefighters rescue someone from a burning building, and a newspaper headline reads, "A firefighter rescues a child," whereas another article says, "Two firefighters rescue a child." Those statements are perfectly compatible. One highlights the primary speaker or actor, the other reports the full number present. Matthew and Mark never say there was only one angel. Luke and John simply provide an additional detail. This is one reason many scholars, including Greg Bloomberg and Michael Licona, argue that these accounts are complementary rather than contradictory. Different witnesses remember different details. The central claim remains the same, that the tomb was empty and Christ was risen.
Welcome to this edition of Another Time. For today's episode, Thank you for watching this edition of Another Time. Goodbye.
Next, we come to the account if the women, did they tell anyone? Now we come to another passage that often raises questions. Mark 16:8 says the women fled from the tomb, trembling, and in one sense said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Yet Matthew records them running to tell the disciples. So, we have to ask, is that a contradiction? Not necessarily, because Mark is describing their immediate reaction, and if we picture the scene, they've just encountered an astonishing event. They're overwhelmed, like I'm sure any of us would be at the same time, and they were frightened. They're processing what they have just seen, and in that moment, they don't stop to speak with anyone along the road. Matthew continues the story by showing that they ultimately obeyed the angel's instruction and informed the disciples. These descriptions fit naturally together. Immediate silence because of shock does not exclude later obedience. In fact, that's actually exactly what we would expect from ordinary human behavior. And in section 2, we're going to talk about why the differences matter. Some people assume that if the resurrection really happened, every gospel should read like a photocopy of the others. But that's not how independent testimony works. I talked last week about how former homicide detective J. Warner Wallace has observed that investigators become suspicious when multiple witnesses tell exactly the same story using the exact same wording. Independent witnesses naturally remember different conversations, different people, and different details. The remarkable thing about the resurrection accounts is not that they differ in secondary details. It's that they consistently proclaim the same central events, that Jesus died by crucifixion, that he was buried, and that his tomb was empty. Multiple followers sincerely believed they encountered the risen Christ. Those core facts unite all four Gospels. The differences are largely in emphasis and detail, not the central proclamation. At the same time, I know that alone doesn't automatically prove the resurrection happened. Historical events require historical investigation, but it does mean that apparent differences should be examined carefully before being labeled contradictions. In the next section, in section 3, we'll look at another set of famous objections. What were Jesus' last words? Who arrived at the tomb first? How did Judas die? Who bought the potter's field? These passages have generated discussions for centuries, and they deserve the same careful, thoughtful examination we've given every other question in this series. So let's start with what were Jesus' last words? Let's move on to another objection that has often been raised. If you spent any time reading lists of alleged Bible contradictions, you've probably heard this one. Critics point out that each gospel records different words spoken by Jesus while he was on the cross. Matthew and Mark record Jesus crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Luke records Jesus saying, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit," whereas John records, "It is finished." So the question then becomes, which one was actually his last statement? Did Jesus say one thing, or did he say several things? The assumption behind the objection is that each gospel writer intended to record every sentence Jesus spoke during the crucifixion. But does any gospel actually claim that? And of course, the obvious answer is not at all. In fact, the gospels regularly summarize conversations. John closes his gospel by saying that if everything Jesus did were written down, he supposed the world itself could not contain all the books that would be written. In other words, the gospel writers were selective. They chose details that best served the purpose of their accounts. And we have to remember here that each of the gospel writers were writing to different audiences. And as such, they wrote down certain details that better fit their message that they are trying to communicate. When we place all four gospels together, many scholars conclude that Jesus spoke multiple sayings from the cross. Traditionally, experts have referred to these as the 7 sayings of Jesus on the cross. Each gospel preserves different portions of those sayings. John emphasizes Christ's completed work of redemption, whereas Luke highlights Jesus' trust in the Father. Matthew and Mark emphasize the fulfillment of Psalm 22 and the depth of Christ's suffering. Rather than contradicting one another, the Gospels provide a fuller picture when read together. Next, we come to who arrived at the tomb first. Another question skeptics often ask is who reached the tomb first? John focuses on Mary Magdalene arriving while it was still dark. The other Gospels describe a group of women arriving around sunrise. So, is this a contradiction? Many commentators suggest the women likely traveled together in stages, while Mary Magdalene either arriving slightly ahead of the others or becoming separated from the group during the events that followed. John's Gospel frequently narrows its focus to individual encounters. He spends far more time describing Mary's personal experience than the other Gospel writers. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are more interested in the group's experience. And again, difference in emphasis does not automatically equal contradiction. Next, we have how did Judas die? Now we come to one of the most discussed passages in the New Testament. Matthew tells us Judas went away and hung himself. The book of Acts says Judas fell headlong, his body burst open, and his intestines spilled out. And at first glance, those accounts sound impossible to reconcile. But did Judas die by hanging or did he die by falling? One common Christian explanation is that both descriptions refer to different parts of the same tragic event. Matthew describes the method of suicide, whereas Acts describe what happened afterwards. In other words, Judas hung himself at first, and after some time, the rope or the branch broke and then fell down. Luke, the author of Acts, simply describes the gruesome result. It's worth noting that Acts never says Judas didn't hang himself, and Matthew never says hanging was the only thing that happened. Those two accounts are describing different aspects of the same death. Even if someone finds another explanation more persuasive, the important point is that those passages are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Next, we come to who bought the potter's field. Closely related to Judas' death is another objection. Matthew says the chief priests purchased the potter's field using Judas's returned silver. Acts says Judas acquired a field with his reward of his wickedness. So, the question then becomes, who bought it? Did the priests buy it or did Judas? And once again, context matters. For example, imagine if somebody says, John bought a new house. Later, another person says, the bank bought John's house. Which is true. In one sense, John purchased the house because it became his. In another sense, the bank supplied the money and completed the final transaction. Both descriptions are accurate depending on what aspect is being emphasized. In the same way, Matthew focuses on the priests physically completing the purchase, whereas Acts emphasizes that Judas' betrayal money ultimately secured the field. Without Judas's actions, the purchase would have never have happened. Therefore, the field could have rightly be associated with him. Different emphasis, same historical event. Next, we have Paul's conversion accounts. Another favorite objection concerns Paul's dramatic conversion on the road to Damascus. Acts records this event 3 different times. Critics sometimes point to differences between the accounts. For example, one passage says Paul's companions heard the voice. Another seems to say they did not. The key lies in the Greek language. The word translated hear can refer either to hearing a sound or understanding a message. Many Greek scholars note that the grammar differs between these passages. The companions heard the sound. They did not understand the words Jesus was speaking to Paul. That's not unlike hearing someone speaking in another language. You hear a sound, but unless you know the language, you don't understand the message. Luke's descriptions fit comfortably within that understanding. So let's suppose I was going to Japan for vacation. but I don't know the language or speak any Japanese whatsoever. I could go there and physically hear a Japanese person speaking, but if I don't know the language, I'm not going to know what they're talking about. So, in the same way, that's what's going on here. And once again, different details highlight different aspects of what's going on. But there are no real contradictions here. Next, we come to faith or works. Perhaps no objection has generated more discussion than this one. Paul writes that a person is justified by faith apart from works of the law. James writes a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. Some conclude that Paul and James flatly disagree, but are they even addressing the same question? Paul, on one hand, is arguing against the idea that anyone can earn salvation through obedience to the law, whereas James is addressing people who claim to have faith while showing no evidence of transformed lives. Paul asks, how is a sinner declared righteous before God? Whereas James asks, what does genuine saving faith look like? They're answering different questions. Paul emphasizes the root of salvation, whereas James emphasizes the fruit of salvation. As Martin Luther eventually came to realize after initially struggling with the book of James, genuine faith inevitably produces good works, not because works save us, but because living faith bears fruit. As the Reformers often summarized, we are saved by faith alone, but that faith that saves is never alone. So here's the bigger picture. Let's pause again and notice a pattern. Over and over again, alleged contradictions often rest on assumptions. The assumption that every author intended to record every detail. There's also the assumption that ancient writers followed modern journalistic conventions. There's also another assumption that different emphasis equals disagreement. There's also the assumption that a summarized account is less truthful than a detailed one. But history doesn't work that way. Eyewitness testimony doesn't work that way. Ancient biography certainly didn't work that way. And once we realize those realities, many of the strongest objections lose much of their force. Now we've examined most of the frequently cited alleged contradictions in Scripture. But before we conclude this series, there's one final question that we need to answer. Even if every one of these passages has a reasonable explanation, the question becomes, why should anyone trust the Bible in the first place? What evidence exists outside of the Bible? What has archaeology contributed? What does textual criticism tell us? And why do millions of thoughtful Christians, including historians, philosophers, scientists, and biblical scholars, continue to believe that Scripture is trustworthy? If you've watched both parts and you still aren't convinced, my encouragement is simple. Don't stop asking questions, but don't stop investigating either. Skepticism can be a healthy starting point, but it shouldn't become a permanent destination. You want to be just as skeptical of your own conclusions as you would of Christianity. So we have to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even if it challenges what you already believe. If Christianity is false, it deserves to be rejected. But if it's true, it deserves to be embraced. Truth has nothing to fear from honest investigation, and neither should we. But if you've listened to everything that I have said so far in this series and you still choose to be indifferent without considering anything that I have said by doing your own honest research, then that is intellectual dishonesty on your part. And I don't know really what else to tell you. Because the fact of the matter is, I did my part by presenting this information, but it's up to you to do yours. At the end of the day, Christianity doesn't ultimately stand or fall on whether every difficult passage has an answer you're personally satisfied with. It certainly doesn't fall on hearsay or popular opinion. It stands or falls on one historical event, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. If Jesus truly rose from the dead, then his claims about himself, his view of Scripture, and his offer of salvation deserves to be taken seriously. The resurrection of Jesus is one of the most thoroughly examined events in ancient history. I'll leave a list of my top recommended picks of various sources you can check out for yourself in the description below. Feel free to pick one that stands out to you. And if you've picked one and you read it, come back to this video later and let me know what you thought about it. I will even leave a link for the YouVersion app if you download your own Bible and read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John for yourself. So my challenge to you is this. Before you decide that Christianity isn't true, make sure you've examined the best evidence for it too, not just the strongest arguments against it. Read the Gospels for yourself. Ask the hard questions. Consider both sides fairly. And don't tell me in the comments that God has never revealed himself to you if you've never asked. As Jesus said, you will know the truth and the truth will set you free. John 8:32. An intellectually honest person would be just as skeptical of their own conclusions as they are of Christianity. Don't believe Christianity because it's comfortable. And you certainly don't want to reject Christianity because it's unpopular. Believe it because you've followed the evidence where it leads. The resurrection of Jesus isn't a blind leap of faith. It's one of the most carefully investigated events in ancient history. If you're the kind of person that's going to tell me in the comments that there's no evidence for Jesus' resurrection, then I would kindly tell you to try telling that to a scholar in Israel or any one of the list of resources of authors that I've listed down below. Historians across the spectrum, Christians, Jewish, agnostic, and even atheists agree on many of the core historical facts. But the real question isn't whether something extraordinary happened. It's what best explains those facts. And one last thing before I close this video. I want you to take a look at this chart because after spending 2 episodes explaining alleged contradictions, there's another important question that we need to ask. I'll go ahead and throw up a chart here, and I'll go ahead and actually just leave it up for a little bit so you can look. There's a lot of text in this chart, so this will give you a chance to look at it while I'm talking over it. How does the textual evidence surrounding Jesus and the New Testament compare with what we have from the rest of the ancient world? Now, these aren't perfect apples to apples comparisons. A manuscript of Plato's writings, for example, is different from a historical source about Alexander the Great. But the comparison still gives us some important perspective on what historians reconstruct the ancient past. Take Genghis Khan, for example. He built one of the largest contiguous empires in human history. Yet much of what historians know about his life comes from historical sources written during or after his lifetime, including the secret history of the Mongols and later chronicles. And yet, nobody seriously argues that Genghis Khan never existed simply because we don't possess thousands of contemporary manuscripts documenting every moment of his life. Then consider Alexander the Great. He conquered much of the known world before dying at age 32. Some of the most detailed surviving narratives about Alexander come from writers like Arian and if I can pronounce this right, Plutarch, who wrote centuries after Alexander lived, drawing upon either sources that are now largely lost. Historians still believe Alexander existed. Then we have Plato, one of the most influential philosophers in Western civilization. His writings have been transmitted to us through an ancient manuscript tradition with copies produced generations after his lifetime. We don't have Plato sitting in a museum somewhere next to the original handwritten copy of the Republic. Yet historians don't conclude that he never existed. Then there's also Julius Caesar. Caesar wrote about his own military campaigns, including the Gallic War, and those writings were copied and transmitted through generations of manuscripts. And again, the original handwritten copies are gone, but historians reconstruct the text by examining the surviving manuscript tradition. Now compare that general picture with the New Testament. We have thousands of surviving Greek manuscripts, from small fragments to complete manuscripts, plus thousands more copies in Latin and other ancient languages. We also have quotations from early Christian writers and an enormous scholarly discipline devoted to comparing these manuscripts. And here's where I want to be very precise. Having more manuscripts does not automatically prove that every event described in those manuscripts happened. But what it does do is that manuscript quantity primarily answers a different question. Can we reliably reconstruct what the authors originally wrote? And when it comes to the New Testament, we have an extraordinary amount of textual evidence with which to do exactly that. Yes, there are textual variants, but because we possess so many manuscripts, scholars can actually compare those differences rather than pretend they don't exist. So I'm not asking you to believe Christianity because a chart told you to. I'm asking you to apply the same principle we've applied throughout these two videos. Examine the evidence, read the Bible in context, study the manuscripts, investigate the alleged contradictions, and ask the difficult questions. And most importantly, investigate the historical case for Jesus Christ and his resurrection. Because ultimately, Christianity does not stand or fall on whether the New Testament has more manuscripts than Plato or Julius Caesar. As Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 15, Christianity stands or falls on whether Jesus Christ actually rose from the dead. So, after two entire episodes asking, can I trust the Bible? Maybe there's one final question we need to ask. If the evidence points to Jesus, what are you going to do about him? Anyway, that's all the time we have for this video. If you enjoyed this video, click like, share, subscribe if you're new. Also, be sure to tap that bell to get all of the post notifications. And if you guys have any other Bible questions, or if you have any questions about other alleged contradictions in the Bible, feel free to ask below. I know this video can't possibly answer every single one of the alleged contradictions. I think if I were to try to do that, this video would probably be several hours long, and I just simply don't have that kind of time. So finally, if you have a dream that you would like for me to interpret for you, be sure to leave that comment below. Just be sure that if it's after the 7 days from the time the video was posted, there's a chance I may not see your comment. So just go ahead and comment on the next updated video or the next video to be posted this Friday. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and close this video out with Numbers 6, 24 through 26. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord lift his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift his countenance toward you and give you peace.